Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
and me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Our featured guest today is Jim Daniels. A native of Detroit, Jim Daniels is the author of numerous collections of poetry and short stories. He's also written and produced 4 screenplays, collaborated with photographer Charlee Brodsky on gallery shows and publication projects, including the book Street, which won the Tillie Olsen Prize, and he has edited or co-edited 6 anthologies. He currently lives in Pittsburgh and is the Thomas Baker University Professor Emeritus at Carnegie Mellon. His recent books include Rowing Inland, Wayne State University Press, and The Perp Walk. He also co-edited the anthology Respect, the Poetry of Detroit Music. Welcome back to the podcast, Jim.
Great, thank you. I'm excited to be here and talk about what I'm doing now.
Well, yes, you've been writing and publishing since 1979, and I think I counted nearly 50 book titles on your Wikipedia page. Do you have a running total of the number of books you've written and edited, and what fuels your prolific creativity?
Insecurity and obsession, I guess, fuels it. But yeah, it depends on how you count them, because I've published a number of limited edition chapbooks and the anthologies. Those are collaborative projects. So I don't know, at least 16 single authored full-length books of poems and 6 books of fiction, and I think 11 chapbooks, 6 anthologies, and 4 films. It's kind of the numbers I got with. But yeah, I'm obsessive about writing, and maybe a little bit too obsessive at times, but I'm driven, and now that I have more time in retirement, I think I'll be focusing even more. And one of the things I'm excited about is catching up on reading. You know, as a professor, you read a lot of student, papers and poems with a kind of critical eye. And so the notion of having more time to read for pleasure is pretty exhilarating.
Is it possible to describe or characterize your body of work and how it's evolved?
Probably. I'll give it a shot. Coming from Detroit, I think a lot of people who read my work would probably see me or identify me with Detroit. Even though I haven't lived there in a long time, I continue to come back to it. Like in my new book, Gun Shy, it's there again. And Pittsburgh's there too. So wherever I'm at, I write about it. But there's something about, where you grew up and where you had all these first time experiences that made you who you are, that I think they call me to revisit them over the years, because I continue to evolve and I see some of these experiences differently. Or I hope I continue to evolve on some level. But that's one thing that, I'm identified with the city, and because I come from multi-generations of auto workers, that comes into my work a lot. And because of my good fortune, I think, of landing in Pittsburgh, the urban landscape in general is my setting. And some people categorize those 2 cities as part of the Rust Belt, and I guess that's not entirely inaccurate in terms of northern industrial cities that maybe have seen better days sometimes. But that's a lot of, I guess, generally what I write about.
So the poems in Gun Shy range across the spectrum timeline of life, exploring your childhood in Detroit, raising your young children in Pittsburgh, and your parents' aging and your own. Did you intend to write these poems as a collection, or were they written over time and collected later?
But yeah, that's a good story. And actually, when I first started, the poems in Gun Shy were parts of two separate poetry manuscripts. I think I was being too distinct in terms of separating maybe Pittsburgh and Detroit, and growing up in Detroit and raising a family in Pittsburgh. When I at some point I came to realize they were parts of the same story. And I think in my mind, at least, one of the central themes of the book is negotiating the territory between, being a parent and continuing to be your parent's child while they're, at least in my case, they're needing more care. So my mother died actually right at the onset of right before the pandemic started. It was on Leap Day 2020. So within 2 weeks, we were basically shut down. School became completely online, but we were able to have a regular funeral for her, which was significant and important, given that we didn't really know anything about the virus at that time. But that exacerbated the situation with my father, who was 93, and he ended up being further isolated. He had just lost his life partner, and then he was kind of restricted to seeing very few people. So that's been a tough go for him. It's something ongoing that I write about, but in terms of the book, I was really feeling it big time because it was a stage in which our children were going out into the world on their own, while our parents were coming closer and needing more help from us. So I ended up kind of toggling back and forth between those places. And of course, one of those physical places is in Pittsburgh, and the others actually in suburban Detroit. My father's still living on his own, remarkably, at 93 in a condo in Sterling Heights.
So what other themes and ideas did you have in mind, or perhaps discover as you worked on these poems as a collection?
Yeah, that's a good question too, because one of the things that I've learned over the years, my first book was published in 1985. And it's interesting, at least to me, that my first book was called Places and Everyone. And I had a slash between places and everyone. And all these years later, I've come back to the slash again with Gun Shy. So the title of the book is Gun / Shy. And in both cases, I wanted to create a sense of seeing these familiar expressions, places, everyone, and Gun Shy, in a new way, so that you see each word separately, and there's a tension between them. But you also see the familiar expression, but the slash kind of interrupts that. So during the process of putting a collection together, you start to see connections. I write a lot, so there are a lot of poems that never see the light of day, and there are also a lot of poems that get published in literary magazines that don't end up making it into books down the line. So I have this process of, I keep full alphabetical folders of all of my poems that have been published in magazines, and then I go, but not in books, and then I go through them and pick out ones that I might think could be in a book, and I separate them into piles, and that might end up being sections of the book, and then begin to winnow them down and make some of the hard choices in terms of getting it to what is typically book length. A book length collection of poetry is typically 60 to 80 manuscript pages, and I tend to push it towards 80, I admit, so that when it's printed, it usually tops out at around 100 pages. But yeah, I began to see these themes emerge, along with other themes too. And then you kind of try to divide them into sections, and then the whole sense of what poems work next to each other. And so it's almost like a book is it's a poem, and you think about how the lines go and work off of each other, so that maybe putting a poem here next in between these two poems might give it more emphasis and maybe tension. So because a fair amount of my work is at least semi-autobiographical, I don't have to introduce people over again, and it helps. So part of the process ends up compressing the poems further. So a lot of my revision, I overwrite in early drafts, and then I come back and cut as much as I can, because I do write fiction. So one of the big differences for me between poetry and fiction is the sense of, well, using the poetic techniques like line breaks are just huge to me in terms of allowing me to cut a few words here and there. So you just pack it tighter and tighter and tighter. And so that's at least some aspects of the process. And then of course the first poem and the last poem are like the first line and the last line of a poem. So you want to pay particular attention to them.
Well, your title poem, Gun Shy, is a long poem which has been set in the middle of the book. So that placement's very deliberate, as you mentioned. And that's like Pulp Fiction style. It starts with a scene where the speaker at 16 had a gun shoved in his face while working at the liquor store. It also incorporates memories of families on the street who shot each other during a Tim Daniels, who's no relation to you, including a Tim Daniels, and looks at race and white privilege, losing virginity, and watching the Limbo on the Windsor TV station. So you've got a quote here: growing up, we had no protection from guns or story problems. The math nearly killed us all. Being white, I can joke about it, sex and guns. The other Daniels shooting his sister. They did not catch the robber with a gun. So what was behind this poem? What inspired you with this? And how do you think the things that you talk about in it have or haven't changed since you were young?
Yeah, that's a good, complicated question, and you can certainly interrupt and follow up on that. So an interesting aspect of that poem is that I wrote it, the first draft of it I wrote while in the throes of Lyme disease. And I was kind of out of my mind. One of the strange things about Lyme disease and scary things is it really messes with your head. And so I was feverish, and I mean, people were getting emails from me and saying, that email you sent, it really didn't make any sense at all, because I was continuing to try and focus and function, but my brain was so scattered and spacey because of the effects of that disease. Luckily, they caught it quickly, and I don't think I'm really experiencing after effects, but it was really pretty awful. But hey, I got this poem out of it because one of the things that being sick like that did is it kind of released some inhibitions in terms of going into more depth and complexity, I think, about this. So as writers, we tend to write about, I shouldn't say we, but at least I tend to write a lot about things that haunt me. And again, that word obsession comes into play again. And one of the things that did happen to me was I was working in a party store very close to so I grew up in Warren. I was born in Detroit, but we moved to Warren. I grew up along the 8 Mile corridor, which is the border between Detroit and Warren and the suburbs, which at that point were basically completely white. And so that's where the racial aspect, I think, comes in terms of, quite frankly, there was there was racism in my community and my family and myself on some level, I'm sure, growing up in that environment. And I need, in order to be truthful, I needed to write the poem that I wanted to write, I had to be honest about that. And so I was working in a store and we were held up. I was actually working in a store illegally because I was only 16 years old and selling liquor, even though I couldn't buy liquor. But it was a little family-owned party store, and you kind of knew all the people who came in. It was like a corner store that also sold liquor. But having a gun pointed at me at that age, and I also grew up in the context of the uprising in 1967 in Detroit, where, I was 11 years old and didn't really have a clue to having any kind of significant understanding of what was going on, when we could actually see smoke from some of the fires and the National Guard helicopters going overhead. But what I did notice and heightened the beginning of my awareness of some of the issues of race was the reactions in my community, in terms of just, it brought out some of the racism and like parents of friends and things like that. Really surprised, I guess, shocked me in terms of particularly on the parental level, these people that you look up to. So that's kind of the context for which, getting held up by the store brought out some of these things as well. So, and the other thing, so I had actually written about being held up in the store before, which is where the obsession idea comes into play, trying to get at, what that meant to me. So the first version of that poem, of that experience I wrote, was in my first book in 1985, and it's just called Hold Up. And the poem was about being haunted by that experience, but I didn't touch on what I think was a huge aspect of it, which was the racial aspect of it, because it was, again, when we talk about white privilege, it was kind of my privilege not to go into that in the poem, quite frankly. And so it took me a while to get there. One of the fortunate experiences I had in graduate school is I had a course that was taught by James Baldwin at Bowling Green State University. They had him as a visiting professor for 2 years in a row for like one semester. It was a huge deal even then. I mean, People magazine was coming in and taking pictures of our class, just because he had spent a lot of time living in France. Having him come to the small college in Ohio to teach was kind of unusual. And one of the things that Baldwin did to me and some of the other white students, I think, is to challenge us to examine our own past more honestly. I mean, I remember him very clearly in class saying, look, I'm the son of a slave and you're the son of a slave owner. Let's start there. And so he was kind of saying, well, in order to move forward, we have to go back. And it was hard for me to go back because it meant bringing out the racism that I experienced or that I contributed to, quite honestly, I think, growing up there in this. It was strange. I mean, in Windsor, I'm sure you're familiar with 8 Mile, and obviously the Eminem film brought that out as well, but it was this sort of border mentality. So at one point when I was there, Warren was essentially one of the largest, most segregated cities in the country, right next to Detroit, which is obviously a huge Black city. And so my high school was maybe a couple miles away from Pershing High School. And so, which was almost complete opposites. So when I was in high school, for example, one time, this shows up in a poem somewhere where we had some Black students from Pershing come to my high school and visit us and talk to us, because there were no Black students at all in the school. And or in the neighborhood that I grew up in, though you crossed 8 Mile and immediately you were entering more integrated communities. So that's kind of the larger context in which that poem emerged, that concentration of the robbery that brought to a head a lot of these issues. And of course, so that's an initiatory experience on many levels. Obviously, being, there is, sex comes into play in that. The poem wanders around because I didn't have any sense of barriers in terms of the trance-like state that I was in from Lyme disease. I wouldn't recommend that to other people to get a serious illness in order to write, but it does sort of loosen up the inhibitions or make you less aware of them.
Not great as a creative technique, then. I understand that. But and in Windsor, we do understand the impact of borders on the psyche and the emotions, and certainly, how that affects people. So in one of the later poems, The Secret Agent Briefcase, you write about when I got my professor gig and that I was a secret agent after all, a double agent. You also talk about the growing emotional and understanding gaps between you and your parents, and that you kept your old factory lunch bucket in your office and rubbed it for luck before committee meetings. Why did you feel like a double agent, and why do you think it was important to remain connected to the factory you worked in when you were young and the way of life you'd left behind?
So I'm a member of the Working Class Studies Association and actually respect the poetry of Detroit music. Recently won the Tillie Olsen Prize for creative writing from the Working Class Studies Association. But one of the things that comes up, because a lot of these, basically Working Class Studies Association is a collection of academics from working class backgrounds, regardless of field. But what unites us is our background. A lot of people talk about the imposter syndrome. And the imposter syndrome can occur in a lot of different settings and situations. But in academia, it often manifests itself as we feel like we are secret agents, like we don't belong here because our backgrounds didn't involve a lot of people, going to college and getting into higher education and things like that. So there's a sense of at some point you're going to be found out and kicked out of the academy, or that you're not quite worthy of the position that you have. And that never entirely went away. And so that lunchbox, which now that I'm retired, I keep on my dresser at home because I still need to rub it from time to time. But it really kept me grounded, because one of the things that actually I continue to write about in a, I hope, a complicated enough way, is that one of the things that I always appreciated about, and this is a big generalization about Detroit, the Detroit area, and also Pittsburgh, is that people generally are pretty direct in how they talk to you. And there's not a lot of nuance or beating around the bush. And so it can almost seem blunt at times, but there's also not a lot of subterfuge and backstabbing and secrecy, which is something that I think is part of an academic environment. So the solidity and directness of that experience and background is, I think, something I came to value. So that poem is, for me at least, is basically about the imposter syndrome and continuing to cope with that. So my parents, I was in an endowed chair at Carnegie Mellon. And so when I got the chair, they did have the ceremony, and I felt very protective of my parents there. It really was almost a primal thing, like a lot of things are with family. It's this instinctual, hey, these are my parents. It kind of surprised me how protective I felt of them in this kind of, academic reception. I mean, in some way it was exciting because it showed that I had achieved a certain level in the eyes of the university. And I wanted my parents to be there. But while they were there, I felt like they were outsiders, just like I had felt like an outsider. So my sense of connection certainly involves a connection of family and community as well. And it's like where you're from, maybe you can criticize it sometimes, but if somebody else criticizes it or looks down on it when they're not from there, that gets your hackles up a little bit. And if I hear other people dismissing it, that's going to get me going a little bit.
Represent. In the poem Hail Bop, the scene is lying in a field of wildflowers at night, your children sleeping on your chest, watching a comet across the sky. We should not map our lives, but we do. The bright smudge of my finger pointing upward as I believed, the sprinkle of trailing stars. What kind of meaning would you like readers to take away from this poem and this book?
It's always a tough question, is it, to say, well, and I like the way you worded it, by the way, because you're not asking me what I meant. Because ideally, you want the poems to speak for themselves, but on the other hand, yeah, you do want people to get something. You want them, it's like, if a poem is like a stadium, a sports stadium, you want them to be in the ballpark. They can sit wherever they want in the stadium, but you want them to at least be looking at the same game, right? And so if they're seeing something that's outside the stadium, then I didn't write the poem good enough. But yeah, that poem, it's interesting you brought that up, because that poem was actually set the first time I came to France, to the small village on my sabbatical. And because it's in the middle of nowhere, the stars are just incredible and brilliant. And it was during the year when Hail Bop was visible. And it was just this amazing thing to just lay down and just look at it and see that trail of stars and the kind of mystery of it. And I guess another theme I've dealt with pretty consistently, and struggled with. A lot of my themes are just things that I struggle with, but the idea of faith and religion, and I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic school through 8th grade. And so that background and that sense of questioning and wonder and what there is to have faith in this life and in this world to sustain us. Because one fact is that we're all gonna die, right? And what's next is could be a variety of opinions on that, but the sense of even space, just and looking up at the sky kind of blows my mind now. Which got me involved in another project, by the way, which is I am the moon poetry consultant for a project that Carnegie Mellon developed. They're sending poetry to the moon next year as part of, and if anyone is interested in this, if you just Google Moon Arts Project or the Moon Arc, A-R-K, it'll take you to the website, because it's not just poetry, it's all the arts that are encapsulated and micro etched on these little things. And so my job was to find poetry about the moon to send to the moon. It wasn't just any poetry, it had to be poetry about the moon. And one of the fascinating things, and I think it connects to your question in a way, because the moon never changes. Well, I mean, it changes in some ways, but in examining moon poetry over the centuries, what's fascinating is it just ends up being a reflection of, because we change on Earth. We've been changing forever. So how we see the moon has changed over time. The moon still does its thing, it phases and controls the tides. But we look up at it and we see different things. And I think just looking up at the stars and having this big open sky, and the moon obviously dominating that sky, takes me to a place that's hard to describe in terms of spirituality, I guess. Without trying to sound too hokey about it, there's a kind of mystery and wonder, I guess. So I'm hoping that the reader might get a little bit of that.
That sounds like an amazing project. Are you working on anything else for yourself right now?
Well, I'm writing new poems, and one of the great things about writing fiction is I can toggle back between poetry and fiction. And I might be putting together another anthology. So I can, in the introduction, mentioned the work with Charlee Brodsky, this photographer, wonderful photographer. I kind of did 2 books in collaboration with her, or with her photos and my poems. This past year, I collaborated with a design professor, Mark Baskinger, and a sculptor and steel fabricator named Dee Briggs. And so we have these, we call them murals, but they're on aluminum panels, huge aluminum panels, 5 different ones, where we integrated my text along with the images that Mark created. And they're kind of like 3-dimensional, or there's holes in them so that the shadows of the words behind them on the wall make the project more dynamic, I think, because it looks differently at different times of the day. But each panel has a theme, and they were erected in the new business quad at Carnegie Mellon. Because of COVID, it was a quiet opening. They finally went up on the wall last summer, but they're up there, and that was. I guess I would like to continue to collaborate with other people across the arts, and so I'm hoping that another project like that is in my future too. And I think that connects to the music anthology that I talked to you about last time, Respect. And as you can see in Gunshine, there are also some poems that touch on music, one as a teenager in high school, and one as an old guy with white hair standing out at a concert, bending down to tie my shoe and having young people think I'm collapsing to the floors. So it's been a constant in my life, and it continues to be something that I write about. And that I mention that because one of the threads that I've been kind of collecting is poetry about. It turns out that I've really written a lot of poems about music, and I think being part of Respect with my good friend Emma Liebler, my co-editor, was that it got me thinking more in terms of subject matter and things to write about. So that poem, Between Double Doors, Fitzgerald High School, deals with, for those of a certain era, Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix died very close together. And there's a whole thing about rock stars who die when they're 26. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but artists who died often from self-destructive tendencies at a very young age. And more conscious, I guess, of how I was fitting or not fitting in my school, because another thing that you may have noticed in some of the poems is just dealing with substance abuse issues, particularly in my younger days, thinking about how the kind of damage that came out of that in terms of both to myself, but also in terms of how I treated other people. When I was growing up, drinking age was 18, and then they raised it back to 21 after they saw that, at least for my generation, that wasn't a very good idea because a lot of us just couldn't handle it. So that connects to the music in various ways.
Well, would you like to read some of your work for our listeners?
Oh, yeah, sure. First one, and actually one of the things that I did in this book is I wrote a fair number of formal poems. where I took a form and then I messed with it a little. So the first one I'd like to read is called Searchlights Over Detroit, which is almost sort of a Villanova. There's a fair amount of repetition in it, which is characteristic of Villanovas, but as you can tell, I didn't exactly, though I almost did in this one. There's quite a bit of rhyming, but not exactly that form. Okay, Searchlights Over Detroit. On nights when searchlights crossed the sky, I believed in magic and riches, God and fame, or at least somewhere to go when I died. Though the beams only meant a sail at some car lot on 8 Mile, or family night at the ball game, on nights when searchlights crossed the sky, with old swords that made brave stars shy. Some nights on our cracked street, I followed their aim until my mother called me in to tell me lies like, we're not poor and boys don't cry. Our lights were dim with no cash and lots of blame. My father worked nights while searchlights crossed the sky. When my grandmother fell out of bed, he and I drove to lift her from the floor in her own shame for being a burden, hating my mother, wanting to die. We passed Mel Farr's Fords, clear halos of lights aimed high, looked like nothing we could ever hope to claim on our way home below searchlights across the sky, leaving us nowhere to go when we died. But just as a footnote there, Mel Farr was a star player for the Detroit Lions football team. And then he owned a series of auto dealerships in Detroit. And this next poem is called Honorary Honor, and it's kind of set in my neighborhood in Pittsburgh, which I liked because no one really cared that I was a poet at all, or really didn't take it very seriously unless my name showed up in the paper now and then. So this is called Honorary Honor. Poet laureate of my neighborhood until I took out garbage on the wrong day. For poets, every day is garbage day, I said. Tell that to the landfill, they said. They appointed the blind woman across the street to replace me. She's loud but polite. Poet laureate of my house until I forgot to make my bed. I'm just gonna lie in it again anyway, I said. They said, you're sleeping on the job, and appointed the dog instead. His poem's untranslatable, but he offers protection. Now I'm poet laureate of my closet. Everyone loves me there, alone in the dark. So poetry is one of those humbling things, and we have to acknowledge that. In this poem, I want to read next, is called High School Diploma 1970. So it really deals with a lot of family history in here and family secrets. And the interesting things for me that has shown up in more recent poems is this big family secret, which was that my father had a brother and a sister who both died when they were early teenagers. So they died tragically. And so tragically that my grandparents never mentioned them. And I didn't even know they existed until I was in college. And I learned that by accident, actually, because I ran into a writer, Neil Shine, who was an editor and publisher for the Detroit Free Press for a long time. And he had happened to go, he had grown up in my father's neighborhood on the east side of Detroit. And so my dad had mentioned him before that, because he had a column in a newspaper. He said, I went to school with Neil Shine. And so I went up and he was giving a talk somewhere. I went up and introduced myself, and he said, oh yeah, I certainly remember your father, but I was better friends with his brother Jack. And I said, who? I mean, that's how I learned, because it was such a tragedy. And Catherine, who would have been my aunt, it's just, and one of the things going through my father's old stuff is finding little clues that connect to that family that I never had. So my sister, by accident, found a postcard that my Uncle Jack had sent my grandparents when he was at Camp Osenham, which was a summer camp from poor city kids in Detroit that they would go to. And it just, and my siblings, it hit us all the same way. It was a really emotional thing, just to see the handwriting of this person that I never knew existed. And just thinking about what might have been. And understanding how it had impacted the lives of my grandparents. And it helped me understand why they were so cold and distant, because of their losses. So that shows up in this poem a little bit, and in some other poems as well. High school diploma, 1917. Marie Cogan, my grandmother, lost 2 children within 2 years. Balancing on a wobbly footstool imported from Ireland, she scrubbed her walls clean of them and never cleaned again. Marie Cogan lied about her age until the past hazed over into truth. The one child left conceded to the ghosts, left home and became my father. Marie Cogan brushed my sister's hair with the violence of a true believer and took communion for superstitious reasons. Marie Cogan played cards with neighbor ladies and collected music boxes, though eventually lost her false teeth and believed I was a doctor come to save her. She took her diploma to the home where it hung above her bed, alone, without photographs. Marie Cogan in stately scrawl enlarged by pride. Few girls finished. Not one careless scrap of her dead children in the stinging white of her tiny shared room lit by music boxes and the stench of dying. My grandfather, entering late through the back door of their rotting wood frame house, takes off his work shoes and hat, washes up at the sink, heads back to his own cold room in the back. He quit school to work at Packard's, lying about his age, then had to lie again, pretending to take the day off to sign up for the draft. The only lies he ever told, except the ones of omission, as far as I know, I, who carried both their caskets and laid them into the earth next to the graves of those 2 children, brushing away dirt from flat stones, carved with the names, never spoke again, except haltingly, once by my father. Marie Cogan, the priest intoned. She lived her whole life in one house until she could no longer. Marie Cogan, I will sing her name in the Old English script. Holy Redeemer High School, have mercy on us all.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We really appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you, and I appreciate your good, thoughtful questions in terms of making me think about, what the heck I was doing when I was trying to respond to, because I'm never quite sure. And that's one of the exciting and scary things about writing poetry, is that you don't know where you're going. And sometimes you're going into places that maybe you prefer not to go. So yeah, I appreciate your time and attention to what I've done, and I enjoyed talking with you all today.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.